Tonight's my first speech for the Australian Greens on the portfolio responsibility for Veterans Affairs. And I've just recently taken over this portfolio from my party room colleague Penny Wright. I'd like to start by thanking her for her hard work and the excellent handover that she's recently given me. I've taken on the responsibility of the portfolio for a number of reasons. The main reasons being I have done some military service myself and know many veterans, and I also have an ongoing interest in military history and military affairs. My service in the military was only short, 3.5 years, from the Australian Defence Force Academy, 1986, graduated in 1988 and went to Royal Military College in 1989. I joined because I wanted to fly helicopters as a young boy, but I was medically discharged in 1989, so my career was cut short. However, I have over the years kept in touch with a number of the close friends that I made with my mates from the time, some still serving ADF personnel, but many also veterans now themselves of both Gulf Wars, Afghanistan and important peacekeeping operations such as East Timor. I was also born into and married into a family of veterans. My father is a Vietnam veteran, as are my two godfathers. Since I did the daily paper round as a young boy in Western Australia through the Veterans Ward at Sunset Hospital, where I met and developed friendships with hundreds of veterans from both the major wars, I've been interested in military history and military affairs. But my interest always vacillates between a strange fascination to learn more and a repulsion and a deep sadness. Recently, my brother, father and I toured the battlefields of World War I using my great-grandfather Clarence's secret war diary, and it only occurred to me then how lucky I was to have met, in my own lifetime, so many veterans from this most terrible conflict. It didn't seem such a big deal as a boy, but it sure does now that I know what I know. Stepping into the fields of Passchendaele, Pozieres, Villers-Bretonneux and the Somme, following the footsteps of my ancestors, was a very emotional and gut-wrenching experience. Although it belongs to another time and another place, I felt many eerie and close connections to this land which witnessed mankind's most brutal hell of hate and fury. I have no doubt this is because of the seeds that were planted during my daily, cheery childhood chats with often lonely and sick veterans. I often reflect the veterans were more interested in the joys of children than they were in the afternoon daily newspaper I had to sell. The commemoration of the Anzacs and the Great War is an important time, a critical time in our and other nations' histories. As a nation and as individuals, we need reminders in order to remember and honour the sacrifice of war and peacetime service. But we also need to be honest and forward-looking in how we do this. We need to use this as a time to reflect and reassess exactly what is the Anzac legend, what does it mean and what should it mean, and not just to us, but to our veterans and to our defence personnel into the future. And I look forward to engaging with the veterans communities and also speaking more on the meaning and interpretation of this commemoration in the Senate over coming months. There are currently 20,164 Australian veteran service pensioners from the Second World War, 4,383 from Korea and the Malayan forces, and nearly 32,000 from Vietnam, 70 from the Gulf War and 348 from East Timor. Undoubtedly more from recent conflicts like Afghanistan will need our support. I enjoyed Senator Farrell's various adjournment speeches on his ancestors' military service, and it's now a great honour and privilege to have the chance to record some of my immediate family's military service. And tonight I'd like to talk about John Henry Browning, but similar to Senator Farrell, I also intend to outline the wartime experience and sacrifice of other family members at another point in time. I started with Johnny, as he was called, because of a recent meeting I had with Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, when he was here in Australia. I attended the official dinner for Mr Abe here in Parliament House and was hoping to personally give him a letter from Paul Watson, asking that he read a plea from the founder of Sea Shepherd to cease the cruel slaughter of whales in the Southern Ocean. I was lucky enough to find an opportunity to respectfully, that evening, look Mr Abe in the eye and hand over this letter from Paul Watson, but I also took the opportunity when introducing myself to inform Mr Abe that my family had relatives my kid's great-grandfather Johnny, buried at Sandakan. And I thanked Mr Abe for his acknowledgement of Sandakan during his parliamentary speech to the Australian people earlier that day. Shinzo Abe said, our fathers and grandfathers lived in a time that saw Kokoda and Sandakan. How many young Australians with bright futures to come lost their lives? For those who made it through the war, how much trauma did they feel years and years later from these painful memories? I can find absolutely no words to say it will ever be enough. I can only stay humble against the evils and horrors of history. May I most humbly speak for Japan and behalf of the Japanese people here in sending my most sincere condolences to the many families and souls who lost their lives and loved ones. And I think all the senators here were probably there for that speech as well. Well, recently my daughter Bronte completed her school assignment on Sandakan, which outlines the details of the military service, life and death of my wife Natalie's grandfather and Bronte's great-grandfather, John Henry Browning, who was brutally murdered during the infamous Sandakan death marches. Bronte worked on this assignment with her grandfather Rob, and I now will quote some content from this work. Johnny served in the Royal Australian Army in the ill-fated 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion during the Second World War. His journey began in northern Western Australia and ended at Ranu, Borneo, as a result of the Sandakan death marches. Johnny was to become one of over 22,000 Australians taken as prisoners of war to the Japanese forces. At the end of the war, only 13,872 of the prisoners were found alive. 1/3 of the prisoners died. And sadly for our family, Johnny was one soldier that never made it home. Johnny first left his hometown of Northam in Western Australia with the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion for training during July 1941 in Adelaide, and then went on to Darwin. After completing their training, the battalion left Darwin on the 30th of December, and while sailing past Port Moresby, were subject to a Japanese attack near Rabaul, New Britain. The convoy was turned around and sent back to Fremantle before continuing on towards Malaya and then Singapore. Having received a frantic phone call from Johnny for a secret meeting, great Nana Thelma, who had not seen her husband in months and had since given birth to their son Robert, travelled with her baby from Northam in rural Western Australia to the Ocean Beach Hotel in Cottesloe to visit Johnny. Johnny had temporarily gone absent without leave, or what's called AWOL, whilst his ship was docked in Fremantle to meet with Thelma. It was a long and difficult trip by train in those days, and by the time great Nana Thelma had arrived with baby Robert, she discovered Johnny had been caught by the military police, drinking in the public bar while he was waiting, and was forced back to his ship. She and Johnny missed each other by so little and never saw each other again. He also never got to meet his son Robert, who never knew the man he would later call his dad. After sailing out of Fremantle, the 2nd 4th Battalion and others, who were now separated into brigades, arrived in Malaya. It wasn't long before they saw action with the Japanese invading force pushing down through Malaya en route to ultimately capture Singapore. The 2nd 4th, along with other Allied battalions, fought a fighting withdrawal along the Malaysian peninsula all the way back to Singapore. Johnny was badly wounded by a bullet in the leg during the short but final Battle of Singapore, but he later recovered, only to be shipped off to Borneo and the horrors of Sandakan. The full story, the complete recollections of the final years of his life at Sandakan, will forever go unknown. Although we do not have the original letters from Sandakan, it is believed they were written by the Japanese to mislead. Although we do have the original letters from Sandakan, it is believed they were written by the Japanese to mislead. However, we can use other sources of information about the atrocities that occurred while Johnny and others were prisoners of war to the Japanese during the death marches. From these other sources, we can presume what he experienced. Yet there is nothing we can imagine from our own lives that will ever compare to the horrors and trauma he and his mates felt and went through. Letters to relatives from his surviving mates after the war suggested he had always faced the world with his customary courage and cheerfulness. Judging from what we know about the Sandakan death marches, it is likely that Johnny was part of and survived the second march. There was two individual marches during the Sandakan period. Although we can't rule out the slight chance he was one of the only 6 who survived the first march, it is more likely he was one of the 183 prisoners who managed to reach Rano in Borneo on the 24th of June 1945, which was in the mountains. This is reinforced by a letter from the Australian government stating he died on the 16th of July 1945, only weeks before the end of the war. This means he survived not only the infamous death marches, but also the horrific conditions at Branno for almost a month following the trek. It should be kept in mind he also had been badly wounded years before with a leg injury. The official cause of death was listed as malaria, but eyewitness accounts later placed such information into question. Reports of beheading and shooting during the final weeks of the war in an attempt to remove all traces of Japanese brutality prior to liberation suggest otherwise. This is a sad story that will be carried down through the family for years to come and was shared by many others. My daughter found investigating Sandakan highly emotional, especially when she thought of the mental and physical state Johnny must have been in for the last years of his life. The most painful part came from reading his earlier love letters and his regret at not getting to meet his new son. These were sent to great Nana Thelma leading up to the fall of Singapore. We can only imagine how shattering it would be to find out about the death of someone close to you through a letter from someone you don't even know. And in Robert's case, imagine what it must have been like growing up and never meeting or knowing what happened to your father. So, the moral of this story is that war is sad, brutal, and that is why it must be remembered, but never glorified. Johnny's story is just one example of why, which we'll be reliving with the Anzac spirit going into the commemoration. And I'll finish this speech with a brief poem written by the Second Fourth, which appeared in the Western Australian News the week they set sail. We came from the west, where the beer is best, parlez-vous. Our camp was better than all the rest, parlez-vous. We came over here, we don't know why, unless they brought us here to die. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous.